I arrived at my son's new condo in March, carrying a small overnight bag and the tin of biscuits I had baked the evening before. The air was still cold, though the snow had melted into gray piles along the street, and a biting wind ran down the block between the tall glass buildings. I stood for a moment on the curb, looking up at his building. It was sleek and modern, all sharp edges and polished surfaces, a world away from the drafty little house he had grown up in. I remember thinking how proud I was of him, how far he had come. When I pressed the buzzer, his voice came faint through the speaker. "Come up, Mom," he said, hurried, as if he were in the middle of something. The elevator ride was quiet, and I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. My scarf was pulled too tightly around my neck, my hair flattened under the wool hat I had worn. I looked every bit like someone's mother, someone older, out of place in a building like this. When the doors opened, he was already standing there, waiting in the hallway. He looked handsome, healthier than I had seen him in a long while, and the sight made my chest swell with a private relief. But the smile on his face faltered almost instantly. He leaned close as he took my bag from my hand, his voice dropping low. "Don't tell the neighbors I'm your mother," he whispered. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The words didn't quite register, not against the warmth of seeing him again. But then I saw the tightness around his mouth, the flicker of embarrassment in his eyes. He wasn't joking. I smiled, because I didn't know what else to do. My instinct, honed over years of smoothing over awkward moments, was to give nothing away. I smiled, nodded even, as if it were a small request, the sort of thing any son might say. Then I stepped into his condo, carrying that whisper like a stone in my chest. Inside, everything gleamed. The walls were painted a cool white, the furniture modern, with lines so straight and clean it seemed no one had ever sat on it. A faint scent of lemon polish hung in the air. It was beautiful, yes, but it also felt carefully staged, like one of those model homes you walk through but never truly live in. I placed the tin of biscuits on the counter, watching his eyes flick to them. He smiled again, distracted, and said, "Thanks, Mom," though his tone suggested he hoped I hadn't brought them at all. I busied myself with taking off my coat, arranging my scarf, anything to keep from sitting down right away and letting the silence grow between us. All the while, his words echoed in me. "Don't tell the neighbors I'm your mother." It wasn't just the request. It was the way he whispered it, quick, almost ashamed, as though my existence was something to be hidden. I had known embarrassment from him before, when he was a teenager and didn't want me to hug him in front of his friends, or when he grew older and asked me not to comment too loudly at his soccer games. But this was different. He was a grown man now, in his own place, and still he felt the need to tuck me away in the shadows. He began showing me around the condo, pointing out the balcony view, the new appliances, the spare bedroom I would be using. His voice was cheerful, practiced, but I couldn't shake the way it faltered every time he passed by the large living room window, as if worried someone might see us together. When we finally sat down, I asked about his work, his schedule, the people he lived near. He answered in half-sentences, vague, always redirecting the conversation. He seemed nervous that I might bring up family, or mention where I lived, or worse, remind him aloud that I was his mother. I noticed he never once called me Mom after that first moment at the door. He used no name at all, as if I were just another guest. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being sensitive, but the longer I stayed, the more deliberate it seemed. On the second day, I ran into one of his neighbors in the elevator, a woman about my age who smiled warmly and asked if I was visiting. "Just a friend," my son said quickly, stepping in front of me, his hand light but firm on my arm. He never even let me answer. The woman smiled politely and said nothing more, but I felt something inside me recoil. That night, when we sat at his table eating the soup I had made, I stirred my spoon slowly, watching the broth ripple. He was scrolling on his phone, barely looking at me. I wanted to ask him directly, to demand why it mattered if the neighbors knew I was his mother. But the words wouldn't come. I had learned over years of motherhood that sometimes silence was safer than confrontation, that pushing too hard only made him retreat. So instead, I ate my soup, listening to the sound of his spoon clink against the bowl, and kept my heart folded neatly inside me. Still, it grew. In small ways, it grew. On the third day, I folded his laundry while he was at work, tucking his shirts neatly into drawers. A faint trace of cologne lingered on the collars. He had a life now, a carefully crafted life, one in which I seemed to be a ghost he didn't want anyone else to notice. When I set his drawer shut, I caught my reflection in the darkened window, small, lined, hair graying at the edges. I thought of how invisible I had become. Not just here, but perhaps everywhere. That evening, I walked outside alone, wrapping my coat tightly around me. The city was alive with movement, people rushing home, couples holding hands, friends laughing into the night. I walked slowly, deliberately, as if trying to remind myself I still existed among them. The wind stunned my cheeks, and I pressed my hands deeper into my pockets. When I returned, he asked where I had been. There was a flicker of irritation in his voice, as if worried someone had seen me. I told him I had just taken a walk, and he nodded, distracted again, already half absorbed by the television. I sat down on the couch beside him, though not too close, and watched the screen without really seeing it. My mind was elsewhere, circling around that first whisper, the way it had lodged itself in me. It wasn't just about neighbors. It was about what he thought of me, of the life I had lived, of the person I had become. Somewhere along the way, my role in his story had shifted from mother to secret, and I didn't know how to step back into the light. That night, lying in the spare bedroom, I stared at the ceiling long after the city sounds had faded. I thought of the years I had given him, the mornings making his school lunches, the nights waiting up for him to come home, the quiet sacrifices that no one else ever saw. I thought of the way I used to tuck him in, whispering promises that he would always be loved, always be safe. And now, here I was, tucked away myself, asked to pretend I was something less than I was. I don't know when the tears began, but they came silently, slipping into my hairline, soaking the pillow. I pressed my hand against my chest, as if to steady it, to keep it from breaking open entirely. I told myself I would only stay until the weekend, then go home. But deep down, I knew something inside me had already shifted. This wasn't just about a visit. It was about the space I occupied in his life, or perhaps, the space I no longer did. By the time dawn came, pale light filling the window, I had decided on one thing. I would not ask him again why. I would not beg for recognition. Instead, I would begin to find out who I was, apart from being someone's hidden mother. And yet, as I sat up in bed, smoothing the blanket, a sharp pang went through me. Because no matter how much resolve I tried to muster, the truth was simpler, I had never wanted to be anything other than his mother. The morning after I made that decision, the quiet vow not to ask, not to beg, I rose early, long before my son stirred. The condo was hushed, filled with the pale blue light of a March dawn, and I moved quietly, almost reverently, through the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea, warming my hands around the mug, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought, oddly enough, of the mornings when he was little, how he used to pad into the kitchen in his socks, rubbing his eyes, asking what was for breakfast. I had always known what he liked, the cereal he favored, the exact way he wanted his eggs, the toast buttered to the edge. Now, I stood in his kitchen unsure of what he even ate. I opened his refrigerator and found it nearly bare. A carton of eggs, a bottle of sparkling water, a few takeout containers with grease staining the lids. Nothing of home, nothing of warmth. I almost laughed at the contrast between the perfection of the condo's appearance and the hollowness of its inside. It was as if he had built a shell of success but had forgotten to fill it with anything that breathed. I cracked 2 eggs into a pan, whisked them gently, and made toast for us both. When he finally emerged from his bedroom, hair damp from the shower, he looked surprised to find breakfast waiting. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice even, almost guarded. "I wanted to," I answered simply. He sat down, ate in silence, his eyes darting occasionally to the window, as though the neighbors might catch him even in this private act of being mothered. Later, when he left for work, I stood at the balcony, watching the city below. Cars moved in orderly lines, people hurried along the sidewalks, their coats pulled tight against the wind. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching a life I was no longer part of. My world had narrowed to his whisper, those 6 words I could not forget. Don't tell the neighbors I'm your mother. All day, I tried to distract myself. I tidied the condo, wiping surfaces that were already spotless. I walked again through the neighborhood, pausing at a small cafe where no one knew me, no one had reason to hide me. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching strangers interact with ease, laughter spilling out like warmth. It struck me then how invisible pain can be, how no one in that cafe would guess what I carried inside, just as I could not guess theirs. When I returned that evening, he was home already, sitting on the couch with his laptop. He looked up briefly, then back at the screen. "How was your day?" he asked without real interest. "Quiet," I said. And it was. Quiet in a way that gnawed at me. That night, something shifted. I found myself opening my suitcase, not to pack, but to take out a scarf I hadn't worn in years. It was a bright one, patterned in deep reds and golds, the kind my son used to laugh at when he was a teenager, saying it made me look like an old woman trying too hard. I draped it over my shoulders and looked at myself in the mirror. My face was lined, yes, but my eyes were steady. For the first time in days, I saw someone I recognized, not just a hidden figure, but a woman who had lived, who had survived, who still had color in her. The next morning, when I walked down to the lobby, the doorman gave me a polite nod. "Visiting?" he asked. I opened my mouth, ready to say, "I'm his mother," but the words caught, heavy, lodged where his whisper had planted them. Instead, I said, "Yes, just visiting." And something in me winced at the ease with which I betrayed myself. As the week went on, the small humiliations added up. A neighbor inviting my son to a gathering but glancing over me as though I were invisible. The way he introduced me once, almost stammering, as a family friend. I smiled then too, playing along, but later, in the quiet of the spare room, I stared at my hands, folded neatly in my lap, wondering when I had learned to accept being erased. It wasn't always like this. There had been a time when he clung to me, when I was the center of his world. The memory of that boy, his small hand slipping into mine as we crossed the street, felt almost cruel now. I wanted to ask him, what changed? But I already knew the answer. Time changed. Pride changed. The kind of success he had built demanded a different story, one where I didn't fit. By the second weekend, I noticed I had stopped baking, stopped cooking, stopped filling the condo with the gestures that once defined me. It wasn't that I no longer wanted to, it was that each act seemed to underline how unwelcome it was. My biscuits had gone untouched, the tin still on the counter, lid unopened. One morning, I quietly slipped it into my suitcase, unwilling to watch it sit there like evidence of a mother's redundancy. One evening, while he was out, I sat on the balcony alone, the city lights blinking like distant stars. I thought of my own home, the worn chair by the window, the neighbors who waved without hesitation, who knew me simply as myself. I thought of how far I had traveled, not in miles, but in distance from who I once was. It was then I realized that silence was not safety. Silence was surrender. Each time I bit back my truth, each time I smiled and nodded, I was not protecting him, I was erasing me. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with a quiet sadness, like water seeping slowly into stone. And in that sadness, a fragile seed of resolve began to grow. I started small. The next morning, when we went down together in the elevator and a neighbor greeted us, I smiled warmly and said, "I'm his mother." My son stiffened beside me, his jaw tightening, but I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the neighbor, who smiled back, surprised but kind. Later, he confronted me. "Mom, I asked you." "Yes, you did," I said calmly. "And I heard you." The look on his face was unreadable, frustration, maybe, or fear. But beneath it, I thought I glimpsed something else, shame. Not mine this time. His. We didn't speak of it again that day, but I knew a line had been crossed. My silence had cracked, and through it, my voice had slipped back into the world. That night, I slept more soundly than I had since arriving. The pillow was still damp from earlier tears, but my heart felt lighter. I was not invisible. Not yet. And yet, the battle was only beginning. Because the truth was, I had to decide whether being in his world, in this polished, careful life of his, was worth shrinking myself for. Or whether the time had come to step fully into my own, even if it meant stepping away from his. The question haunted me as March unfolded, each day a little brighter, the air a little softer with the promise of spring. I walked longer distances, lingering in bookstores and cafes, savoring the freedom of being unrecognized, unhidden. I began to see the city not just as his world, but as a place where I, too, could exist. One afternoon, I bought myself a new notebook from a small shop on the corner. Its cover was plain, brown leather, but it felt firm, grounding in my hands. That evening, while he sat watching television, I sat in the spare room and began to write. Not letters to him, no, I had written those before, letters never sent, folded away in drawers. This was different. This was for me. I wrote about the whisper, about the way it felt to carry it, about the ache of invisibility. I wrote until my hand cramped, the words spilling out faster than I could catch them. When I finished, I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. A way of claiming space again, of hearing my own voice even if no one else did. Days slipped by, and the rift between us grew quieter but deeper. He stopped asking about my walks, and I stopped volunteering answers. We existed side by side, but rarely together. And yet, beneath the distance, I felt myself shifting. Each step I took alone, each word I wrote in that notebook, became a stitch in the fabric of someone I had nearly forgotten, myself. Still, the question lingered, sharp as glass. Could I remain in his life if I had to remain hidden? The answer, I knew, was coming. Slowly, inevitably, like spring itself. The first real crack in our fragile arrangement came a few days after I had called myself his mother in the elevator. He hadn't mentioned it again at first, but the air between us had shifted. It was quieter, more brittle, as though one wrong movement might shatter it completely. That evening, as I chopped vegetables in the kitchen, I heard his footsteps approach behind me. He lingered in the doorway, arms crossed, his silhouette cutting a dark figure against the light from the hallway. "Why did you do that?" he asked finally. His voice wasn't loud, but it was tight, each word pulled taut like a string that could snap. I set the knife down carefully, resting both hands on the counter. I could have lied. I could have said it was a slip, that I hadn't thought. But I had thought. I had thought of it all night before, and all morning leading up to it. "Because I am your mother," I said quietly. He sighed, rubbed his forehead. "Mom, you don't understand. People here, they make assumptions. It's different. I don't want them to look at me differently." "Because of me?" I asked. The words hung there, heavier than either of us wanted. He didn't answer. And maybe that was the answer. I went back to chopping, though my hands trembled slightly. He stood there a moment longer before retreating, and the silence that followed was worse than any shouting would have been. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. The city hummed faintly beyond the glass, and I thought of all the mothers in all the apartments scattered across the skyline, some cherished, some forgotten, some, perhaps, hidden like me. I wondered how many of them had sacrificed pieces of themselves for children who no longer recognized them as whole. The next morning, I made myself another vow: I would not shrink again. Not in elevators, not in lobbies, not in the face of his embarrassment. If he could not carry me openly as his mother, then I would carry myself openly, whether he claimed me or not. It started with small things. I introduced myself to the doorman by name. I lingered in the laundry room when other residents were there, chatting lightly about the weather, about the stubborn chill that refused to leave the city even as March wore on. No one recoiled. No one questioned my presence. They were polite, even kind. The world did not collapse because I existed. But he noticed. Of course he noticed. One evening, he came home later than usual, his face drawn tight. He tossed his keys onto the counter and said, "I heard you were talking to Mrs. Keene today." "Yes," I replied simply. His jaw flexed. "I asked you not to." "No," I interrupted gently. "You asked me not to tell people I'm your mother. That's different from me being a person who speaks." He stared at me then, really stared, as if seeing me for the first time in years. There was anger in his eyes, yes, but beneath it, something softer, something almost like fear. "You don't get it," he said finally, and walked into his room, shutting the door behind him. I stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the counter, breathing deeply. No, I didn't get it. Or maybe I did, and I just couldn't bear to accept it, that he thought of me as a liability to his image, a wrinkle in the polished story he told of himself. That night, instead of crying, I opened my notebook and wrote until my hand ached. I wrote about the eggs I made for him, the scarf I wore, the way his whisper had carved a wound I couldn't ignore. The words filled the page like water finding its level, and for the first time, I felt less like I was drowning. But the next morning, I saw the consequences. He was distant, colder than before, as though punishing me with silence. When I offered him tea, he declined without looking up. When I asked about his day, he answered with single words. And though I told myself I wouldn't shrink, I felt myself folding inward anyway, the old instinct to smooth, to soften, creeping back in. I found myself baking again, though I hadn't meant to. A simple loaf of bread, the way I used to when he was young. The smell filled the condo, warm and yeasty, the kind of scent that wraps itself around you like memory. He emerged from his room, paused in the kitchen doorway, and for a fleeting second I saw the boy he once was, curious, hopeful, comforted by something as simple as bread. "Smells good," he muttered. "It'll be ready soon," I said. When we sat down to eat, he tore off a piece and ate silently. I waited, hoping for something more, a thank you, a smile, anything. But none came. Instead, he ate quickly, then rose from the table. "Don't expect me home early tomorrow," he said, grabbing his coat. "I've got plans." "Plans with who?" I asked. "Just people," he said, and left before I could ask more. I sat at the table long after he was gone, the bread cooling between my hands. It wasn't about bread, of course. It was about the gulf between us, a gulf that widened each time he chose secrecy over truth, image over blood. And yet, I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Something in me still hoped. Hoped that the boy who once clung to my hand was still in there, waiting to surface. Hoped that one day he would look at me and see not embarrassment, but the mother who had built the foundation he now stood on. The days blurred. I filled them with walks, with writing, with small conversations with strangers who didn't know they were helping me remember who I was. I bought myself a new pair of gloves, soft leather that fit snugly, and when I wore them, I felt strangely dignified, as though clothing alone could remind me of my worth. But the whisper never left me. It sat at the base of my skull, replaying at odd moments, when I brushed my teeth, when I stirred soup, when I lay down to sleep. Sometimes I imagined saying it aloud myself, testing the weight of it on my tongue. "Don't tell the neighbors I'm your mother." The words tasted bitter, almost poisonous. One night, after he came home late again, I found the courage to ask, "Are you ashamed of me?" He froze, halfway through setting his keys down. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, finally, "It's not about you, Mom. It's about me. How I want to be seen." I swallowed hard. "But I am part of you." His face twisted, a flicker of conflict flashing through. Then, with a weariness that cut me deeper than anger ever could, he said, "Not here, you're not." And he walked into his room, closing the door. I sat at the table again, notebook open but untouched. His words echoed in me, sharp and unyielding. "Not here, you're not." It was the closest he had come to admitting the truth, that in this gleaming condo, in this carefully curated life, there was no place for me. But the strange thing was, instead of breaking me further, his words settled like a stone in my stomach, grounding me. They were cruel, yes, but also clarifying. If he would not claim me, then I would claim myself. The next day, I wore my red and gold scarf again. I walked through the lobby with my head high. When a neighbor greeted me, I smiled and introduced myself without hesitation. And though I felt the echo of his disapproval waiting for me upstairs, I also felt something new, the stirrings of freedom. Because the truth was dawning on me, slowly but unmistakably. I could not change how he chose to see me. But I could change how I chose to see myself. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. It was a Friday evening when everything finally came to a head. The condo was unusually alive that night, the hum of voices from neighboring apartments drifting through the walls, the faint strains of music echoing down the hall. I had just poured myself a cup of tea when my son stepped out of his room, dressed sharply in a jacket I hadn't seen before. "You're going out?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yeah. A dinner thing," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. "With work?" I pressed. He hesitated. "Kind of." I watched him for a moment, the way he stood so tall, shoulders squared, every line of him polished. He looked like a man who belonged in this building, in this city, in this life he had built. And then I thought of myself, my scarf folded neatly on the chair, my notebook waiting on the desk in the spare room, my hands wrinkled from years of washing dishes, folding laundry, living quietly. "Will I meet them?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. His reflection stiffened in the mirror. He didn't turn. "Not tonight." "Not tonight," I repeated. The words tasted familiar. They sounded like postponement, like avoidance, like never. When he finally did look at me, his eyes were wary, as though I might accuse him of something he wasn't ready to confess. "Mom, please don't make this harder." I held his gaze. "Harder for who?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his coat and left, the door closing firmly behind him. I sat with my tea long after it went cold. I thought of how many times I had asked that same unspoken question in my life, "Do I belong here?" And how often the answer had come not in words, but in silence. By the time he returned, it was past midnight. I was still awake, sitting in the darkened living room. He paused when he saw me there, his face flushing as though caught in something he didn't want me to witness. "Why are you still up?" he asked, loosening his tie. "I wanted to see you," I said simply. His jaw tightened. He sat across from me, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Mom, we need to talk." I nodded. "Yes. We do." He exhaled, long and weary, as if summoning words he had carried for too long. "I know I hurt you with what I said. But you have to understand, this world I'm in now, it's different. People judge. They look at where you come from, who your family is, what it says about you." And he trailed off, shaking his head. "I just don't want to give them a reason to look down on me." "And I'm that reason," I said quietly. He winced. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, filled with all the years between us, all the sacrifices unspoken, all the love that now sat bruised and awkward in the space between mother and son. Finally, I said, "Do you know what it felt like, hearing those words? Don't tell the neighbors I'm your mother. Do you know what it does to someone who has carried you, raised you, given you everything they could, to hear that their very existence is something to be hidden?" His eyes dropped to the floor. "I wasn't thinking of it like that." "Then how were you thinking of it?" I asked. My voice was steady now, though my hands trembled in my lap. He struggled for words, but none came. The truth was too plain, too sharp. He didn't want to be tethered to me, not here, not in this polished version of his life. And yet, watching him, I felt a strange mixture of grief and clarity. For so long I had clung to the hope that if I stayed quiet, stayed useful, stayed present, I would still belong. But here it was, the truth I had avoided. In his story, I was a footnote he wanted erased. I rose from the chair slowly, my knees stiff, my body older than my heart wanted to admit. "I won't stay where I am unwelcome," I said softly. His head shot up. "Mom, that's not." "It is," I interrupted. "You've made it clear. You may not have meant to, but you have." He looked stricken, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to take it back, but no words came. And I realized, with a weight that was both painful and freeing, that I didn't need them anymore. That night, I packed a small part of my things, not everything, not yet. Just enough to signal to myself that the leaving had begun. The scarf. The notebook. The tin of biscuits, still unopened. I folded them carefully into my bag, the sound of the zipper loud in the quiet room. When I lay down to sleep, I felt no tears this time. Only a deep, aching stillness. The next day, I took the train across town alone. I wandered through neighborhoods I had never seen, stopping at a park bench to watch children play, their laughter rising freely into the air. No one hushed them, no one asked them to hide who they were. They belonged, fully, simply, without question. I pulled out my notebook and began to write again. But this time, I didn't write about him. I wrote about myself. About the girl I once was, before I was anyone's mother, the woman who loved books and long walks and scarves with too much color. I wrote about what it felt like to reclaim even a small corner of that woman again. When I returned to the condo that evening, he was waiting, pacing by the window. His relief at seeing me was obvious, though he tried to mask it. "I was worried," he said quickly. "I went out," I replied simply. "Where?" "Nowhere you need to know." The word surprised me as much as him. I had never spoken to him like that before. But it felt right, not cruel, not sharp, but honest. A reminder that I was not here to be managed or hidden. He didn't argue. He just nodded, and for once, let the silence fall without filling it. That night, I slept with the window cracked open, the cool air brushing against my face. And for the first time since arriving, I dreamed of something other than his whisper. I dreamed of a house by the sea, quiet and small, with windows that opened wide to let the wind rush in. I dreamed of myself sitting at a table by that window, notebook open, pen moving steadily. Not hidden. Not diminished. Simply myself. When I woke, I knew the dream was not just fantasy. It was a map. The time was coming, I realized, when I would have to decide. Stay here, folded into the shadow of his life, or step into my own. And though my heart ached, though every part of me still longed for the boy he once was, I knew the direction I was leaning. Because as much as I loved him, I could not keep erasing myself for the sake of his neighbors. The morning after I packed my small bag, I woke before dawn, sitting quietly in the spare room as the city lights blinked out one by one. My son still slept, his door shut, his world sealed. I looked around the tidy little room, the folded blanket at the foot of the bed, the neatness that seemed more like a hotel than a home. It struck me then, nothing here was mine. Not the walls, not the air, not even the space I took up. I was a guest, tolerated at best, hidden at worst. When the sun rose, I took the train again, this time farther. I wandered streets lined with bookstores and cafes, neighborhoods that smelled of bread and coffee instead of polished wood and disinfectant. In one shop window, I saw a sign for a small community writing group. Open to all, beginners welcome. I stood there for a long time, staring at the paper taped crookedly to the glass. The younger me would have walked right in. The mother me hesitated. The woman I was becoming again stepped inside. The group was small, 4 women and 1 man, all with notebooks and steaming cups of tea. They welcomed me without question, as though my being there needed no justification. We read aloud little snippets of what we had written, and I heard my own voice tremble when I shared a passage from my notebook. About the whisper. About the erasure. They listened, not with pity, but with recognition. One woman reached across the table and touched my hand lightly. "That's beautiful," she said simply. I hadn't been called beautiful in years, not me, not my words, not my existence. The compliment rooted itself deep inside me. When I returned to the condo that evening, my son looked up from the couch. "Where were you?" he asked. His tone was less sharp now, but still cautious, as though he was afraid of the answer. "I was writing," I said. "Writing?" "Yes. With people who wanted to hear me." The flicker in his eyes was unmistakable: confusion, maybe jealousy, maybe fear of losing control of the version of me he had built in his head. He said nothing more, and I didn't elaborate. That night, I lay in bed and thought about the table in that cafe, the soft murmur of voices, the way my words had landed in the air and been received without shame. I realized then that there were other ways to belong. Ways that did not depend on being claimed by someone else. Days passed, and I kept going back. The group became an anchor, a small reminder that my voice had weight. I began writing longer pieces, not just about him, but about myself. Childhood memories, long-forgotten dreams, the feel of the wind on my face when I first learned to ride a bicycle. Pieces of me I had shelved away came tumbling back onto the page, and with each word, I felt less like a shadow. At home, the distance between us widened. He asked fewer questions, and I offered fewer answers. We ate in silence more often than not. And yet, I no longer felt the same hollow ache. I had something beyond his condo walls, beyond his neighbors' gazes. I had something of my own again. But one evening, the silence finally broke. He came into the kitchen as I was washing dishes, his face drawn, his shoulders slumped. "Mom," he said, almost in a whisper, "why are you pulling away?" The question startled me. For so long, I had thought it was only him creating the distance. I dried my hands slowly, turned to face him. "I'm not pulling away," I said softly. "I'm just standing where I belong." His brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm your mother whether you tell the neighbors or not. It means I can't live as if I don't exist, just so you can feel comfortable. And it means I have a life of my own, even if you don't see it." He looked stricken, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "I didn't mean." "I know," I interrupted. "But meaning and doing are different things." He sank into a chair, rubbing his hands together. For a moment, I almost went to him, the old instinct rising, to comfort, to soften. But I stayed where I was. I had comforted him his whole life. This was the first time I realized I had to comfort myself instead. The days after that conversation felt lighter somehow. Not because we had resolved anything, but because the truth was finally spoken. The pretense was gone. He knew where I stood now, and I no longer had to hide behind smiles. I began making plans. Quiet ones, at first. Looking at apartments in older buildings where the rent wasn't crushing, where the walls carried history instead of polish. Small places with space for a table by the window, space for my notebooks, space for me. The thought of leaving his condo filled me with both grief and relief. Grief for what it meant, that the bond one once imagined unbreakable had, in some ways, broken. Relief that I could finally breathe without holding my breath for someone else's approval. One Saturday, I visited a place near the river. The building was worn, the paint chipped, but the apartment was small and bright, with a window that looked out on water. I stood there in the empty room, sunlight falling across the floor, and I imagined myself sitting at a table, writing, drinking tea, living without apology. When the landlord asked if I wanted to take it, I said yes before I could second-guess myself. The keys jingled in my hand, light and heavy all at once. When I returned to the condo that evening, my son was out. I sat on the balcony, the city stretching endlessly in front of me, and I realized I no longer needed it. The view, the shine, the performance of success. I had something better, a small room with sunlight, a place where I wasn't hidden. Telling him was harder than signing the lease. When I finally did, his face twisted with shock. "You're moving out?" "Yes," I said. "But, where will you go?" "I've already found a place." He looked at me then with something I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. For a moment, I thought he might cry. But he didn't. He just nodded slowly, as though he were trying to understand a language he had never bothered to learn. "I thought you wanted to be here," he said finally. "I wanted to be with you," I corrected gently. "That's different." The silence that followed was heavier than any before, but not unbearable. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. That night, as I packed my suitcase for real, folding each piece of clothing with care, I felt a bittersweet ache. I was leaving, yes. But I wasn't running away. I was walking toward something. Toward myself. The day I moved into my little apartment by the river, the air was unseasonably warm for March. I carried my suitcase up the narrow stairs, the handle digging into my palm, my heart pounding with both effort and anticipation. The apartment was small, just 2 rooms, really, with scuffed wooden floors and a window that opened onto the water below. But when I turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: belonging. The landlord had left a vase of daffodils on the counter, their yellow heads nodding toward the light. I set my suitcase down and touched one gently, the petals soft against my fingertips. It wasn't much, this little place. But it was mine. Mine in a way the spare room at my son's condo had never been. I spent the first hour simply walking the space, touching the walls, opening cupboards, running my fingers across the cool surface of the table by the window. I could already see it, my notebook stacked neatly, a pot of tea steaming beside me, words spilling out into the quiet air. Not hidden words. Not whispered words. Words that belonged. When evening came, I unpacked my bag slowly. The scarf, folded neatly, went over the back of the chair. The notebook, with its pages heavy with pain and memory, sat in the center of the table. And the tin of biscuits, still unopened, I placed on the counter. I smiled at it then, a small, private smile. I would open it one day, when I was ready, not because I needed someone else to eat them, but because they were mine to savor. The first night was quiet, too quiet. The sounds of the river lapping against the banks were unfamiliar, and the walls creaked differently than those of the condo. For a moment, as I lay in bed, I felt a pang of loneliness so sharp it stole my breath. I almost reached for the phone, almost dialed my son's number, almost begged for reassurance. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence settle around me, and slowly, it began to feel less like emptiness and more like peace. In the days that followed, I built small routines. Morning walks by the river, afternoons spent writing at the table, evenings with a book and a simple meal. The writing group became my anchor, my circle of quiet witnesses. Each week, I read more, not just about him, but about myself, the girl I had been, the woman I still was. And each time they listened, nodded, reached out with kind words, I felt myself stitching back together. But leaving him wasn't as simple as moving out. He called, at first often, then less so. "How's the new place?" he would ask, his voice awkward, as though speaking to a stranger. I would tell him it was fine, and then silence would stretch between us until one of us made an excuse to hang up. Once, he came to visit. He stood in my little apartment, his tall frame filling the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the scuffed floors and the daffodils now fading in the vase. "It's nice," he said, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. "It's mine," I replied gently. He sat with me for a cup of tea, and for a moment, it felt almost like the old days, the two of us sharing quiet, the rhythm of mother and son intact. But then his phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, his attention pulled elsewhere. The moment slipped away, as quickly as it had come. After he left, I sat alone at the table, my tea cooling. I realized then that love doesn't always mean closeness. Sometimes it means distance. Sometimes it means letting go of the version of the bond you wished for and accepting the one you have. Spring unfolded slowly. The trees along the river sprouted green, the air grew softer, the days longer. I found joy in small things again, the call of a bird in the morning, the weight of a new pen in my hand, the warmth of sun on my face as I sat by the window. And though the ache of his whisper never truly left me, it dulled, softened, became something I could carry without it crushing me. One afternoon, I walked past a mirror in the hallway and paused. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch at the woman staring back. Her hair was streaked with gray, her skin lined, but her eyes were alive. There was a steadiness there, a quiet strength that had survived heartbreak and found something on the other side. I thought then of the first night in his condo, the tears soaking my pillow, the ache of being asked to hide. And I thought of now, standing in my own space, unhidden, unashamed. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was simply truth. In May, my son called and asked if I would come to a gathering, a work event, something formal. His voice was tentative, almost uncertain. "You don't have to," he added quickly, as though protecting himself from my refusal. I considered it for a long moment. Once, I would have leapt at the chance, desperate to be included, desperate to be claimed. But now, I weighed it differently. Not from need, but from choice. "Yes," I said finally. "I'll come." When the evening arrived, I dressed in a simple blouse and that same red and gold scarf. As I stood in front of the mirror, I tied it with care, not as an act of defiance, but as a declaration, this is who I am. At the event, people smiled, introduced themselves, asked about me without hesitation. And when he introduced me, finally, properly, as his mother, I felt a ripple of something I hadn't in a long time. Not validation. Not pride. But relief. Relief that I no longer needed this moment to know my worth. I had already found it. That night, when I returned to my apartment, I placed the scarf back over the chair, opened the window, and listened to the river below. I sat at my table, pen in hand, and wrote a single line in my notebook, "I am not hidden anymore." And as I closed the book, I felt a quiet stillness wash over me. Not joy, not sorrow, something deeper, something steadier. The knowledge that life had shifted, that love had changed shape, but that I had survived it. I leaned back, hands folded in my lap, and let the silence settle around me. This time, it did not feel empty. It felt whole. Because in the end, I realized, the truth was simple. I had arrived at my son's condo in March and been asked to erase myself. But I left having found something greater, myself, unhidden, unashamed, alive. And that, I thought, was enough.